The wind tore through the barren plain, dry and merciless. It was a sound that Silas knew better than any human voice, a constant companion in the vast, dusty emptiness he called home. His homestead was a testament to endurance, a small cabin and a sturdy barn carved out of a landscape that gave nothing easily. For 5 years, he had lived in the grip of a crushing silence, a quiet born not of peace but of a profound and hollow guilt. His days were measured by the swing of an axe, the mending of fences, the relentless rhythm of work that kept the ghosts at bay. He chopped wood deep into the night, as if splitting his guilt into pieces, each log a penance for a life he had failed to save. The pale winter sun would find him already at it, his shoulders weary, his face a mask of weathered stoicism. Inside his cabin, the air was thick with memory. A small, unused rocker sat in the corner, covered by a dusty sheet. He never looked at it directly, but its presence was a constant, dull ache in his chest. He was a man who had walled himself off from the world, building his fortress not of stone, but of silence and solitude. The town of Redemption was a place one passed through, not a place one stayed. It was a collection of dusty buildings huddled together against the indifferent sky, populated by faces as worn down as the land itself. Silas rode in once a month for supplies, his expression unchanging, his interactions brief and purely functional. He would nod at the blacksmith, trade a few necessary words with Henderson at the general store, and then retreat back to his isolation. Today, however, something was different. A woman stood near the store, her frame so slight the biting wind seemed to threaten to carry her away. She held a small child, a boy of maybe 3, who was wrapped in a thin, frayed blanket and clutched tightly to her chest. The woman's face was a study in concealed suffering. Her eyes, tired and alert, had seen everything and expected nothing. She was not broken, but she was exhausted down to her very soul. In her hand, she held a simple gold band, a ring worn smooth with time. She was trying to trade it, her voice a low, unsteady murmur that was swallowed by the wind. Silas watched from across the dusty street, his hands tightening on the reins of his horse. He felt a familiar tremor inside him, the ghost of a memory he spent every waking hour trying to bury. The woman on the hill, the small grave beside her. The cold had a way of bringing it all back. Henderson, the store owner, was a man whose heart had long since hardened. He squinted at the ring, then at the woman's desperate face. "Gold ain't worth much out here, missus. Food is food," he gestured dismissively. "Got no use for sentiment," the woman flinched, pulling the ring back slightly, her last link to a life that was gone. The child coughed, a dry, rasping sound that cut through the air. She crouched, murmuring to him, her body a fragile shield against the world's cruelty. Silas felt the numbness that was his constant armor begin to crack. He saw not just a stranger, but a reflection of his own failure, a pain he understood with visceral certainty. He didn't know it yet, but his first true home was right in front of him, shivering in the relentless wind. He dismounted, his movements deliberate, his boots stirring the dust. The creak of the saddle leather was the only sound he made as he tied his horse to the hitching post. He walked towards the woman, towards the ghost of his past, his shadow stretching long and silent before him. He was about to do something against his nature, an act not of logic but of pure, raw impulse. The woman, Alara, saw him approach and her body went rigid. Men like him, broad-shouldered, weathered, their power etched into the lines of their faces, were a source of danger, not salvation. She had learned that lesson in the bitterest of ways. She clutched her son, thin, closer, her knuckles white. The store owner, Henderson, looked up, a flicker of interest in his dull eyes. Another man loitering on the porch, a land baron named Jedediah Thorne, whose gaze was like a physical weight, smirked. "Well now, Henderson," Thorne drawled, his voice thick with casual cruelty. "Looks like the lady might have another buyer." Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. She lowered her gaze, trying to make herself invisible. Silas stopped before her. He didn't look at Thorne. He didn't look at Henderson. His eyes were on the small, worn ring in her hand. For a long moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, caught in the silent space between them. The wind howled, whipping a strand of her hair across her face. He remained silent. Then, "I don't want gold." His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder, and used and deep. Alara froze, bracing for the inevitable proposition, the price she would have to pay. Thorn chuckled. "Then what do you want, friend?" "Surely not the company." Silas finally lifted his gaze, not to Thorn, but to her. His eyes were the color of a slate evening sky, and in their depths, she saw not avarice, but a profound and ancient sorrow. "But you," he said, the words simple, direct, and utterly confounding. "You and the boy. You need food." He turned to Henderson, his back a solid wall between Alara and the mocking world. "Give her what she needs. Flour, salt pork, beans, coffee. A warm blanket for the boy." He laid a few heavy coins on the counter, the metal clinking on the worn wood. The sound was definitive. Henderson, surprised into action, began to gather the items. Thorn watched, his eyes narrowed with a mixture of amusement and contempt. "Buying yourself a stray, Silas? Thought you preferred your own company." Silas didn't answer. He stood by the counter waiting, his presence filling the small store. Alara hadn't moved. She was trapped between disbelief and a deep, instinctual fear. This was a kindness she couldn't comprehend, and kindness without a clear price was the most dangerous kind of all. When the supplies were packed into a burlap sack, Silas lifted it as if it weighed nothing. He walked back to her. He didn't offer a hand, didn't smile. He just nodded toward his wagon. "Come on." It wasn't a question. She hesitated, her mind racing. Go with this silent stranger into the wilderness, or stay here and face starvation or the likes of Thorn. She looked down at Finn, whose small face was pale with cold. There was no choice. "I ain't saying nothin'," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Just don't send me back." He nodded once. A sharp, decisive movement. He helped her onto the wagon seat, his touch brief and impersonal, then lifted Finn and the sack of supplies into the back. As he climbed up and took the reins, he didn't look back at the town. He just drove, heading out into the vast, unforgiving plains, leaving redemption and its judgments behind in a cloud of dust. Something had changed. For both of them. The journey was carved from silence. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels, the soft jingle of the harness, and the relentless sigh of the wind across the plains. Alara sat beside Silas, as far as the narrow seat would allow, her hands clenched in her lap. She kept glancing at him from the corner of her eye, trying to read the impassive set of his jaw, the unyielding line of his shoulders. He was a landscape unto himself, weathered and remote. He never spoke. He just drove, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if he could see something there that she could not. Finn slept in the back, cocooned in the new blanket, his small body rising and falling with each breath. He was warm for the first time in days. That, at least, was real. As the sun began to dip low, casting long, distorted shadows across the land, the homestead came into view. It was a lonely sight. A simple, sturdy cabin and a barn standing defiant against the endless expanse of sky. It looked less like a home and more like a final outpost at the edge of the world. Silas brought the wagon to a halt. He gestured with his chin towards a second, smaller structure a short distance from the main house. It was a rough-hewn shack, barely more than a single room. "There," he said. It was the first word he had spoken in hours. He unloaded the supplies and set them by the door of the small cabin. He carried the sleeping Finn inside and laid him gently on a narrow cot. When he turned, Alara was standing in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself, a sentinel of suspicion. He looked at her, then at the sack of food. That should last a while. He turned and walked back to his own cabin without another word. The wooden door closed behind him with a quiet finality. The days that followed settled into a strange, unspoken rhythm. Alara and Finn lived in the small shack, a world apart from the man in the main house. She would rise with the pale dawn, start a small fire in her rusty stove, and prepare a simple meal of beans or porridge. She would watch Silas from her window as he worked. He moved with a deliberate, tireless energy, chopping wood, tending to his horse, mending things that didn't seem broken. His work was a form of prayer, or perhaps a form of forgetting. He never approached her cabin. He never spoke to her. They were two solitary planets orbiting the same bleak sun of survival, their paths parallel but never touching. She was a ghost in his landscape, and he was a shadow at the edge of her vision. The separation was a tangible thing, a chasm of distrust and unspoken history between the two small buildings. She was terrified of him, of the debt she now owed, of the price that had not yet been named. He, in turn, kept his distance, treating her with a cautious formality that was more isolating than outright cruelty. He was afraid of the emotions she stirred in him, the echoes of a past he had tried to bury under 6 feet of earth and 5 years of silence. One evening, as a slate sky bled into darkness, she saw him walking towards the rise on the hill behind his cabin. He carried a shovel. He stood there for a long time, a solitary figure against the fading light, before he began to dig, clearing weeds from a patch of ground she couldn't quite see. She watched until the darkness swallowed him completely. She didn't understand. She only knew that his silence was not empty. It was full of ghosts. And she was afraid she and Finn were about to become two more. The first gesture was almost invisible. A few mornings after their arrival, Elara stepped outside into the frosty air to find a small, neat stack of split firewood next to her door. It hadn't been there the night before. She looked over at Silas's cabin. There was no sign of him, only a thin curl of smoke rising from his chimney into the pale morning sky. She felt a prickle of confusion. He had given her an axe along with the other supplies. He had no reason to do this for her. She hesitated, then quickly carried the wood inside, her heart pounding with a strange mix of gratitude and suspicion. The next day, it was a bucket of fresh water from the well, saving her the long, cold walk. He left it on her stoop before dawn, a silent offering in the pre-light gloom. She never saw him do it. These acts were as quiet and unobtrusive as the man himself. He was a ghost, leaving traces of a kindness she couldn't bring herself to trust. One afternoon, while mending a tear in Finn's thin coat, she noticed the boy's shoes were worn through at the sole. She had nothing to patch them with. Her stomach twisted with a familiar, helpless anxiety. That night, she lay awake, listening to the distant howl of a coyote, a lonely sound that echoed the ache in her own heart. The following morning, a small pair of mended leather shoes sat on the porch. The stitching was rough but strong, the leather treated with oil to keep out the damp. They were Finn's shoes, taken and returned in the dead of night. She picked them up, her fingers tracing the thick, deliberate stitches. A man who could have demanded anything had instead chosen to secretly mend a child's shoes. A trembling, unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was something more fragile, a flicker of curiosity about the man in the other cabin. She began her own quiet ritual. Each morning, after he had left his silent gift, she would brew a tin cup of coffee, strong and black, the way she imagined a man like him would take it. She would place it on the railing of his porch, a place where he would find it upon his return from his morning chores. She would watch from her window as he approached, saw him pause, and then pick up the cup. He would drink it standing there, looking out at the vast, empty land. He never acknowledged her gesture, just as she never acknowledged his. It was a silent conversation, spoken in firewood and coffee, a fragile bridge being built across the chasm of their solitude. One evening, a biting wind began to rise, rattling the loose pane in her window. The temperature plummeted. She saw Silas outside, banking dirt against the foundation of her small cabin, sealing the cracks against the coming cold. He worked for over an hour in the growing dark, his breath pluming in the frosty air. When he was finished, he walked back to his house without a glance in her direction. Later that night, huddled with Finn under their blankets, she heard a soft thud against her door. She waited, her breath held tight, until she was sure he was gone. When she opened the door a crack, she found a heavy wool blanket, worn but clean, folded neatly on the step. She brought it inside, the scent of wood smoke and clean linen clinging to it. It felt like a promise of warmth, a shield against the encroaching winter. As she spread it over her sleeping son, she realized the silence between them was beginning to change. It was no longer a wall of separation, but a shared space, filled with the weight of things unsaid and gestures quietly given. She was still afraid, but now, a new feeling was growing alongside the fear. A tentative, fragile trust. The blizzard arrived without warning, a furious swirl of white that erased the world. The wind screamed like a banshee, throwing sheets of snow against the thin walls of Alara's cabin. The landscape, once merely empty, was now actively hostile, a churning vortex of ice and fury. For 2 days they were prisoners in their separate shelters, the world reduced to the space within 4 walls. On the 3rd day, Finn's cough returned, worse this time. It was a deep, wet sound that rattled in his small chest. By evening, a fever had taken hold. His skin was hot and dry to the touch, his breathing shallow and quick. Alara bathed his forehead with snowmelt, but the fever kept climbing. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw at her throat. She was alone, miles from any doctor, with her child fading in her arms. She had no medicine, no knowledge of herbs, nothing but her own terror. As night fell, Finn grew delirious, murmuring incomprehensible words, his small body trembling. She knew with a dreadful certainty that if she did nothing, the fever would take him. The man in the other cabin was her only hope. Swallowing her pride and her fear, she wrapped the heavy wool blanket around Finn, pulled on her coat, and stepped out into the storm. The wind tore at her, a physical blow that stole her breath. The snow was knee-deep, a blinding, swirling whiteness that disoriented her. She could barely see Silas's cabin, a faint, smoky lamp glowing in its window like a distant, unreachable star. She fought her way across the short expanse, each step an agony of effort. The snow stung her skin, the cold seeping deep into her bones. When she finally reached his porch, she was gasping for breath, her knuckles raw as she pounded on the heavy wooden door. The sound was swallowed by the storm. She pounded again, harder, using all her remaining strength. The door creaked open. Silas stood there, silhouetted against the warm light of his cabin. He saw her tear-streaked face, the desperate terror in her eyes, and the small, blanket-wrapped bundle in her arms. He didn't speak. He just stepped aside and held the door open. For the first time, she stepped inside his home. It was sparse and clean, dominated by a large stone fireplace where a healthy fire blazed. And in the corner, she saw it, the small, dust-sheeted rocker. He took Finn from her arms with a surprising gentleness and carried him to the hearth, laying him on a pallet of furs. "Fever," she choked out, the word a ragged sob. He nodded, his expression grim but calm. He went to a wooden chest and took out a small tin box. Inside were dried herbs and roots. He worked with a quiet competence, crushing leaves, boiling water, preparing a poultice for Finn's chest and a bitter tea for him to drink. He moved with the deliberation of a man who had done this before. The memory was a palpable presence in the room. He tended to the boy through the long, dark night, his large, calloused hands surprisingly deft. He spoke to Finn in a low, soothing murmur, words Alara couldn't quite hear. She sat in a chair by the fire, watching him, a silent, helpless observer. The stoic mask had fallen away, and in its place was a man wrestling with his own ghosts. She saw the deep well of pain in his eyes, the source of his suffocating silence. As dawn approached, the storm began to subside, and in the quiet that followed, Finn's fever finally broke. His breathing eased, and he fell into a deep, natural sleep. Silas looked over at her, his face etched with exhaustion. The silence between them was no longer one of distance or suspicion. It was the quiet of a shared vigil, a fragile peace forged in a crucible of fear. The world outside was a blanket of pristine white when the blizzard finally passed. The sun, pale and watery, cast a crystalline light over the snow-covered plains. Finn was weak but recovering, his fever gone, replaced by a healthy appetite. They had stayed in Silas's cabin, an unspoken agreement that the small shack was no place for a sick child. The air between them had shifted. The silence was still there, but it was softer now, less a barrier and more a shared space of understanding. But their supplies were running low, depleted by the storm. A trip to redemption was unavoidable. The journey back to town felt entirely different from the first. Alara no longer sat rigid at the edge of the seat. Finn, bundled warmly between them, chattered quietly, pointing at the glittering snow. Silas even responded with a few low rumbles of his own, a quiet word here and there. A fragile sense of normalcy, almost of family, had begun to settle over them. He didn't know it yet, but this feeling, this quiet connection, was the home he had been unknowingly searching for. Redemption, however, had not changed. As their wagon rolled down the main street, heads turned. Eyes followed them, filled with a cold, knowing curiosity. In front of the general store stood Jedediah Thorne. He was flanked by two of his ranch hands, his expensive coat a stark contrast to the worn clothes of the townsfolk. When he saw them, a slow, malicious smile spread across his face. He stepped forward, blocking their path. Well, Thorne's voice boomed, loud enough for everyone to hear. Look what the storm blew in. Silas and his purchased pet Alara flinched as if struck. She instinctively pulled Finn closer, trying to shield him from the venom in Thorne's words. She lowered her gaze to her lap, her face burning with shame. The laughter of Thorne's men was sharp and cruel. Silas halted the wagon, his hands tightening on the reins. He sat perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask. Still enjoying your investment, Silas? Thorne taunted, stepping closer to the wagon. He peered at Alara, his eyes lingering on her with a demeaning familiarity. I offered her a fair price for a winter's work. You paid for the whole woman. Tell me, was she worth it? The townsfolk who had gathered watched in silence, their expressions ranging from pity to morbid fascination. This was a common cruelty, a casual humiliation they were all too familiar with. Alara felt tears welling in her eyes. She wanted to disappear, to dissolve into the cold air. She squeezed her eyes shut. Then she felt a movement beside her. Silas was getting down from the wagon. He moved not with anger, but with a solid, deliberate calm that was far more intimidating. He walked around to her side of the wagon and stood between her and Thorne. He was not as tall as the land baron, but he seemed to cast a much larger shadow. His presence was a silent, immovable declaration. She's with me, he said. The words were quiet, but they cut through the cold air with the force of a blade. Thorne laughed, a harsh, grating sound. We all know that. What I'm asking is what you paid. Everyone's got a price. Silas met Thorne's mocking gaze. The silence stretched, heavy and taut. Then Silas spoke again, his voice clear and steady, for all of redemption to hear. Not bought, he paused, letting the words sink in. Chosen, the crowd fell silent. Thorne's smirk faltered. The word hung in the air, simple and profound. Alara looked up, tears streaming freely down her face, blurring the image of the silent man standing like a fortress in front of her. He stayed. The ride home was a study in profound, unbroken silence. The world seemed muffled by the snow, the only sound the soft crunch of the horses' hooves and the whisper of the runners on the packed trail. The words Silas had spoken in town echoed in the quiet, changing everything. Chosen. The word was a balm on a wound Alara hadn't known was still bleeding. It was a declaration of worth, a gift of dignity she had long since stopped expecting from the world. She risked a glance at him. His profile was turned to her, his jaw set, his eyes on the path ahead. But the tension in his shoulders was gone. He seemed lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from him when he had spoken those words. He had not just defended her. He had claimed her not as a possession, but as a person. When they reached the homestead, the slate evening sky was settling over the land, painting the snow in shades of lavender and gray. He helped her and Finn down from the wagon. Instead of turning toward his own cabin, he followed her to the porch of the small shack she had once called hers. He didn't go inside. He just sat on the top step, his back against a post, and looked out at the darkening plains. After she had put a sleeping Finn to bed, Alara came back out, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. She sat down on the step beside him, leaving a small, respectful space between them. The wind rustled the bare branches of a lone cottonwood tree, a dry, whispering sound. For a long time, they just sat, sharing the immense quiet of the coming night. It was she who broke the silence first. "My husband," she began, her voice soft and unsteady. "He made promises, said we were going west for a new life." She paused, swallowing against the tightness in her throat. "He found a new life, with another woman. He sold my passage to a man in the next town to pay his debts. That's how I ended up." Before, she didn't need to say more. The story of her betrayal and loss hung in the cold air between them. Silas listened, his gaze never leaving the horizon. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He just nodded, a slow, solemn movement of his head. His silent presence was more comforting than any platitude. It was an acknowledgement of her pain, a quiet sharing of her burden. Then he spoke, his own voice raw with a grief that was still fresh after 5 long years. "There's a rise on the hill." He gestured with his chin towards the place she had seen him that first evening. "My wife, Sarah, and our daughter, Lily," the names were like stones he had carried in his heart, finally laid down. "Fever took them, both in a week. I was away on a cattle drive trying to earn enough to build a better house. I came back and they were gone." He breathed out, a long, shuddering sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years. "I buried them myself. I thought if I stayed here, worked till I couldn't feel anything, I was paying for not being here when they needed me." He fell silent. The confession lay bare between them, a wound exposed to the healing air. Alara felt her own sorrow resonating with his. She understood his silence, his guilt, his need to punish himself. Slowly, tentatively, she reached out and placed her hand on his forearm. It was a simple, fleeting touch, skin against rough wool. But in that small gesture, 2 fractured souls connected. The vast, lonely wilderness around them no longer felt empty. They were not alone. Winter finally released its icy grip, its retreat slow and grudging. The snow melted, revealing the damp, dark earth, and a pale, watery green began to tint the plains. With the thaw came a change in the rhythm of the homestead. It was no longer a place of 2 separate orbits, but of one shared existence. The unspoken agreement made during the blizzard had become permanent. Without discussion, Silas had moved his few essential belongings from the main cabin into the smaller one, which now felt less like a shack and more like a home. The door between them was no longer a barrier. The daily routine, once a marker of their isolation, now became a language of partnership. In the mornings, the smell of her coffee mingled with the wood smoke from the fire he had built. He would go out to tend the horse and chop wood, and when he returned, she would have a hot breakfast waiting. He started teaching her the ways of the land. He showed her how to read the sky for weather, how to set a snare for rabbits, how to properly mend a fence so it would stand against the wind. She was a quick study, her hands, once soft, becoming capable and calloused. She, in turn, brought a different kind of life to the homestead. She found a small, protected patch of earth near the cabin and, using seeds she'd found in a forgotten corner of a supply sack, started a small garden. The sight of the first green shoots pushing through the soil was a miracle, a stubborn promise of life in the harsh land. The greatest change was the sound of laughter. It started with Finn. Freed from the confines of winter, he explored his new world with the boundless energy of a child. He would chase grasshoppers, his shrieks of delight echoing in the quiet air. At first, the sound was jarring to Silas, a painful reminder of the laughter he had lost. But slowly, imperceptibly, it began to heal him. He found himself watching the boy, a small, tentative smile touching his lips. One afternoon, he sat on the porch, carving a piece of wood. Alara watched him, curious. Over several days, the block of wood slowly took shape under his patient knife. It became a small, sturdy horse, simple but perfect in its form. He sanded it smooth and gave it to Finn. The boy's gasp of joy was a sound purer than any Silas had heard in years. He felt a warmth spread through his chest, an unfamiliar sensation that pushed back the cold emptiness. The homestead was no longer just a place of survival. It was becoming a place of living. The empty rocker in the main cabin was brought over and placed by the fire. Finn would sit in it, rocking back and forth, clutching his wooden horse. The sight no longer brought Silas pain. Instead, it filled the cabin with a sense of rightness, of a circle being completed. The ghost of what he had lost was being replaced by the vibrant, living presence of what he had found. It was a home, built not of wood and stone, but of quiet gestures, shared work, and the slow, steady growth of trust. Love grows where no one looks. It is a stubborn, resilient thing, like a wildflower pushing up through a crack in a sun-baked rock. It does not need grand declarations or flowery prose. It thrives in the silence between two people, in the shared language of a tin cup of coffee left on a porch rail, in the deliberate stitches mending a child's shoe. It is nurtured by the quiet dignity of a man who stands before the world and declares a woman chosen, not bought. On that harsh and unforgiving plain, a home was being built, not from the timber Silas cut, but from the fragments of two broken lives being pieced together. A home is not four walls and a roof. It is the sacred space between two hearts that have found shelter in one another. From the dust of loneliness and the silence of grief, a family was taking root. Silas had come to this place to bury his heart, to live out his days in a self-imposed penance. He had surrounded himself with a fortress of solitude, believing it was what he deserved. He didn't know that redemption wasn't a punishment to be endured, but a gift to be accepted. It arrived not on horseback with a thunderous roar, but as a quiet woman with haunted eyes, clutching a small child and a worn gold ring. He hadn't understood it then. His act of kindness in redemption had been an impulse, a painful echo of his own past loss. He saw a mother and child in the cold and acted to assuage the ghost of the wife and daughter he had failed. He didn't know that in saving her, he was creating the conditions for his own salvation. He didn't know it yet, but his first true home was right in front of him from the moment she looked at him with those weary, suspicious eyes. It was in the shared vigil through a blizzard, in the defiant stand against a town's scorn, in the simple touch of her hand on his arm. Each quiet act of service, each shared meal, each silent moment on the porch watching the sunset, was a stone being laid in the foundation of a new life. This is the simple truth of the human heart. It is made to connect. Even when it is shattered, it yearns to be whole again. It finds its healing not in grand gestures, but in the steady, reliable presence of another soul who sees the wounds and chooses to stay. Their story was not a romance written in sonnets, but in the prose of daily life. The rhythm of an axe, the smell of baking bread, the sound of a child's laughter carried on the wind. It was a love story told in the language of survival, which, in the end, is the most profound language of all. The late spring sun cast a warm, golden light across the homestead. The garden Alara had planted was flourishing, a vibrant patch of green against the brown earth. The air, once biting and merciless, was now soft, carrying the scent of wildflowers and damp soil. Life had returned to the land and to the people who lived on it. Silas sat on the porch step, the newly finished rocker beside him. It was made of sturdy cottonwood, sanded so smooth it felt like silk beneath the fingers. It was not the ghost-haunted rocker from his past, but a new one, solid and real, a testament to the present. Inside the cabin, the open window let in the gentle breeze and the sound of Alara humming softly as she kneaded dough for bread. The sound was a quiet melody that had become the background music to his life, a sound of contentment and peace. Finn played in the dust near the porch, his small wooden horse his constant companion. Silas watched him, a feeling of deep, quiet joy settling in his chest. It was a feeling he had thought was lost to him forever, buried on the hill behind the house. He had spent 5 years living beside a grave, but now he was finally living in a home. He picked up the rocker, its weight familiar and comforting in his arms, and carried it inside. He set it down near the stove, in the warm heart of the room. It looked as if it had always belonged there. Alara looked up from her work, a light dusting of flour on her cheek. She smiled at him, a genuine, untroubled smile that made her tired eyes shine. It was a smile that held all the history of their shared journey. The fear, the suspicion, the storm, the confession, and the slow, steady blossoming of trust. He walked over to her, his footsteps sure and quiet on the creaking floorboards. He reached out and gently brushed the flour from her cheek with his thumb. It was an act of simple, profound intimacy. He looked into her eyes, and for the first time, she saw them completely clear. The shadows of guilt and grief finally washed away. "Stay here," he said. The words were quiet, a mere whisper in the warm, sunlit room. It was not a command. It was not even a question. It was a plea, an offering, the final piece of his walled-off heart laid bare. She nodded, her own eyes shimmering with unshed tears of happiness. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of wood smoke and earth. "We're home," she whispered, and in the vast, silent wilderness, under the wide and watchful sky, they were. From dust and silence grew a home. From closed hearts, a family. Theirs was a love forged in hardship and tempered by the quiet dignity of survival. A testament to the truth that even in the most desolate of landscapes, life and love can find a way to bloom. If the story touched you, like warm light in a cold night, then carry it with you. Remember that courage is not always loud, and the most profound connections are often built without a single word. True strength is found in the quiet choice to stay, to protect, to choose another person's worth above all else. Subscribe to our channel for more stories full of silence, courage, and genuine closeness. And tell us what moved you the most. Was it the silent gesture of the mended shoes, the defiant stand in town, or the quiet confession on the porch? We'll see you again, where silence means home.